Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. We've got a few housekeeping items that we need to take care of as we go ahead and get settled in for this really great event that we've put together with Keystone Medical Technologies and Mach7 Technologies. If you get a moment, before I start moving into the webinar, it is titled, Why Choose a Vendor-Neutral Archive to Drive Your Enterprise Imaging Strategy. If you could please, within the application itself, there's a lot of interactive features that we have. If you can see my screen, just go ahead and raise your hand for just one moment. This way it'll give me a good indication that you're actually seeing what we're showing. So a few hands have gone up. Beth, thank you for raising your hand. Anyone else out there that is Kevin, Kim, thank you very much. Michelle, Michael. All right, so we've got good participation and we've got some engagement here. In addition to that, in the bottom right-hand or left-hand corner, however you may have your screen configured, we do have the ability to answer questions throughout today's webinar to make it as interactive as we possibly can. In addition to that, during this 60-minute webinar, we will have a chat. So please feel free to ask questions, get engaged. They don't always have to be questions. They could be general comments and statements. We like this to be as a two-way situation as we possibly can. Also, during the course of today's webinar, we're going to take a pause about every 10 to 15 minutes and answer some of those questions to try and, again, make this as engaging and as interactive as we possibly can. Towards the end of today's webinar, we're going to take a polling question. Again, participation there is voluntary, but it's always appreciated. So with that said, neutrality, driving clarity into your enterprise imaging strategy. We're going to jump into this and go ahead and move ahead to our agenda. And this is the time that I'm going to pass the webinar over to our featured speaker from Mach7 Technologies. Eric Rice is the Chief Technology Officer, and I had a great pleasure of working with Eric in the planning, research, and the development of this webinar. So it's with great pleasure at this time that I'm going to hand things over to Eric, and he's going to walk you through the agenda and through the rest of the webinar.
Thank you, Dennis. So first of all, I appreciate everyone's time today. It's always a pleasure to have an opportunity to speak to others in the industry. You know, I myself have been in this industry for about 15 years and claim to be the expert of none of it, but greatly enjoy learning from our customers and other experts in the industry, and like a V&A, try to consolidate all that information into some meaningful message. So I appreciate, again, everyone's time today. From an agenda perspective, you know, I'm going to start off, actually I'm not sure how many of you have been on a past webinar I've given, but I'm going to start off recapping a little bit of the history of our industry and where we've come from. I think for myself at least, it's helpful to understand where we've come from to try to see how we can progress and continue to push through the industry. So first thing on the agenda, imaging hindsights and a bit of speculation as to where I believe we may be going. And then moving on from there, let's talk about vendor neutrality. Let's try to define it and what that really means. You know, a lot of people talk about vendor neutral archives, but there's also a lot of misnomers and misconceptions potentially of what a vendor neutral archive really is and what it can provide. So let's talk through that a little bit, and then we'll move on to considerations. So when you're planning that enterprise imaging strategy, what should you take into consideration? What do we see our customers prioritizing as higher priorities, and how you can move forward on a solid enterprise imaging strategy based on a vendor neutral platform. And finally, we'll talk about some takeaways and try to summarize up what we've talked about for the last 60 minutes. So with that, I'll move on. And as Dennis stated too, you know, I will pause. We have some transition slides. If there are questions, please submit them through the chat to Dennis, and we'll pause and take those as they come up. So to kick off, imaging hindsight and a bit of speculation. You know, I like to talk about a little bit of the history. You know, I say I'm sitting here today because in 1970, the first digital CT scanner came out. And from 1970 to about 1990, the digital scanners were coming out, but the physicians were having to walk to each of those scanners to be able to interpret the images. There's no way to communicate the images across to different workstations. Ultimately the physician would have preferred to be able to sit in his office or her office and read the studies as they came in. So around 1980, actually, the first standards came out to be able to communicate those digital images. So ACR NEMA version 1, ACR being the American College of Radiology, NEMA being a North American electrical standard, came out with the first standard. But as standards go, the first one usually doesn't get very highly adopted. But that led into the second standard, which came out just prior to 1990. And it was really at this time with ACR NEMA version 2 standards, I'd say imaging IT was born. Actually, the first time you could go to RSNA in 1990, that was the first time you could go and buy a workstation that could talk to a modality of a different vendor. Those modality workstations, were given birth. Modality integrations, became something real. At that point, sites were looking at reducing their film costs. How do I scale my physicians to be able to read more images without having them walk between each of the exam rooms? And so forth. So, from that, in the early 90s, I like to say it was the PACS honeymoon. Most facilities in the United States wanted to go digital, and most did. And I'd also say a lot of vendors made had their heyday. If you look at a lot of the executives across a lot of the more traditional PACS companies, even at the broader enterprise level, a lot of those executives came out of the imaging group in the early 90s. One of those big movements in the early 90s was really the foundation of DICOM version 3 standard. DICOM version 3 is what we still use today, and it's really the third generation of the ACR NEMA standards that was simply rebranded as DICOM, as we didn't want it to be seen as an American standard and more of a global standard. But with that, the PACS market was born. What is a PACS? It's a picture archive communication system. The picture being the viewer, the archive being how we store it, communication being how we move those images around. Those first PACS systems were installed in the early 90s. They're primarily purchased based on clinical buying decisions. As a radiologist, I had a preference for this particular vendor because it had the right tools for me to diagnose the patient, and those buying decisions, ran throughout the 90s. This is really gave birth to that PACS 1.0. As we moved into the 2000s, we started to see a little bit of pushback from IT. And from a buying decision perspective, IT was saying, hold on a second. I have found myself, those early adopters in the 90s of PACS were coming up to their second term buy of a new PACS. And IT was saying, wait a second, we had this PACS, but all the data is dirty. And my wife changed her name from Amy Roth to Amy Rice. And maybe it updated in the PACS database, but the files on the storage device still say her old name. The data was proprietary. And actually on the comment of proprietary, I don't necessarily blame the PACS vendors in PACS 1.0 for creating proprietary data, but it's hard to move away from it. The PACS vendors, again, the core decision makers have been the clinicians in driving features into the viewers so they'd have the right tools to diagnose a patient. But in doing so, a lot of the PACS vendors were ahead of the standards. Grayscale presentation state, annotations, Windows width, Windows level, different things like that, weren't necessarily in the DICOM standard early on, and therefore the PACS vendors came up with proprietary ways of working around it to get the features to the clinicians that they needed. But those proprietary things have propagated. Still today, many PACS vendors, many PACS solutions installed across our industry and market have proprietary formats. We also saw in the 2000s, now everything's digital. We've moved off of film. We don't have to have a film library, but oops, I just lost that rack of servers. Did I have a second copy of those digital images, and how do I recover from a disaster of that sort? Hospital consolidation, we're still seeing a lot of it today. Hospitals being bought into larger IDNs, and as they come in, many of the larger IDNs are finding themselves with many different types of PACS systems, across many different vendors. Regional exchanges, we're seeing more and more of those at the state level here in the United States. EMR image enablement, obviously a big driver right now around getting everything in an electronic medical record, helping to better enable sharing and access of data, helping to, as meaningful use goes, helping to better enable a patient to have access. And then lastly here, just around storage challenges. So as we went to the 2000 and the second term PACS decisions came up, there's starting to be a lot of questions, and sites ran into a lot of challenges around how they're going to get to that next version of PACS. With that being said, though, PACS 2.0 was born, and kind of what was the big thing with PACS 2.0? It was the thin clients, it was enhanced workflow, having more advanced work lists, having reporting built in and tightly integrated. And I put EMR integration there in a little bubble, as that integration started around PACS 2.0. But as we'll talk further today, there's more room for improvement there. So coming out of the 2000s or 2010, coming into 2010, we start to see some trends. One, from a clinician's visualization solution perspective, we're starting to see visualization tools getting thinner and thinner. Going zero footprint. It's not all that uncommon now to see a full diagnostic viewer that does MIP, MPR, 2D and 3D visualization without needing to install anything. And as that happens, having more flexibility on the devices that you can view on. Can I check this patient's emergency case from home before I come into the office? How can I scale and have different viewers across my different specialties? But from a back-end perspective, from an archive and communication perspective too, we've seen the emergence of the VNAs. If you look at kind of the original VNA vendors in our market, many of those VNA vendors started as those disaster recovery archives. As I talked in the prior slide, those DR archives is where really that vendor neutrality started. But we've seen that even evolve. How can these VNAs provide a bigger role, not only just as a DR archive for radiology or cardiology, but how can it be the long-term storage across all the specialties, across dermatology and dental and ophthalmology and even pathology? And how can we use that consolidated storage then to better provide access and sharing, to image enable that EMR, to image enable that patient and physician portal? And beyond that even, how can we use that back-end archive and communication system to better enable workflow between sites and between potentially different facilities within an enterprise? So kind of in summary here, PACS 3.0, actually, and I didn't necessarily, I obviously did not come up with this. As I stated in the beginning, I'm a great consumer of other people's great thoughts. But there is an article that came out, actually it was almost over a year ago now. There was an article in Health Imaging called PACS Dead, Dying, or Being Reborn. I certainly don't think PACS is dead. I don't think PACS is dying, but I do think it's being reborn in a way. And if we look at what I've just spoke to over the last few slides, in the 90s we had PACS 1.0. It was really about moving off of film and getting digital, and evolving those standards. DICOM actually came out. HL7, a lot of IHE work happened in the 90s, and it's still happening today. In the 2000s, we saw PACS 2.0 come out, having that diagnostic reporting, with really a focus on that diagnostic reporting workflow. More advanced work list, having better voice recognition and reporting workflows built in. But as we came into 2010 and beyond, we're starting to see that PACS 3.0, the third generation of PACS, and it's a lot about the business intelligence and the data analytics and the enterprise interoperability around how PACS can communicate and how you can get the data out of it. Especially with how payer systems are changing, those analytics are becoming more and more important. And although we will always need to continue to push on the visualization side of PACS, the picture system, we always want to provide that. At the end of the day, we're all here to diagnose a patient, provide the best patient care. But you'll see in PACS 3.0, there's a lot of emphasis on the back end and the data and how we manage the data. So as I say, PACS is not dead, it's not dying, but I do see it being reborn in a way. And as we talk about our own solutions here at Mach7, we talk about how PACS can be optimized. As I look at what is a PACS again, it's a picture archive communication system. That picture system, we believe should from a diagnosis perspective, should be departmentally focused. Departments should be able to go in and pick their best of breed picture system, whether it be an advanced visualization, 2D, 3D, 4D, in a thick client or thin client or zero footprint. Our clinicians who know their specialties and subspecialties best should have some flexibility and control to pick what those picture systems are. From below the line though, and again, that should be the clinical buying decision. Below that though, from an enterprise perspective, how can we advance that archive and communication system, the A and C and PACS? That archive being the vendor-neutral archive, and the communication being that communication workflow engine, that imaging workflow engine. And the combination of that A and C and PACS is what we really term as the enterprise imaging platform. So actually, as we talk quite a bit to our customers, we talk about, what is that enterprise imaging platform, and what is your strategy for consolidating that storage across your enterprise and better providing access and sharing and better enabling the specialists to pick those best of breed viewers. What does that look like within your, what does that potentially look like within your enterprise? As we talk about our enterprise imaging platform, again, it's a component of that is that vendor neutral archive. Another component of it is that communication or imaging workflow engine. It is the A and C and PACS, the archive and communication. And with that enterprise imaging platform, we're trying to consolidate across the specialties, radiology imaging, cardiology imaging, dermatology, ophthalmology, wound care, whatever it may be able to consolidate that within the vendor neutral archive. And to highlight there, it's not just DICOM imaging. Obviously, outside of radiology and cardiology, it's TIFF images and ophthalmology, it's AVI and endoscopy, it's JPEG and dental. There's a lot of different formats out there beyond just DICOM. So as you consolidate all that storage in that vendor neutral archive, you then have simplified your image enablement to your EMR. You have simplified your image enablement up to your physician and patient portal. Instead of having to do an integration to each of these systems for viewers and train your thousands of users on different viewers, you have one viewer from the enterprise imaging platform to train and deploy and integrate to. But beyond that too is an important piece, and I would encourage you, for those of you looking for a vendor neutral archive, I would encourage you to look beyond just the archiving piece. There's a lot of workflow around how archiving happens. And it's really the workflow engine that really enables, I believe, really completes that strategy. It's the workflow engine that enables communication with outside imaging. It may be with other facilities, it may be with some of the common cloud vendors out there, such as eMix and LifeImage. And by no means am I trying to promote any particular vendor here. I'm just trying to show a sampling. But having an imaging workflow engine to enable better workflow with outside imaging, whether it be auto-generating orders or resolving duplications of order numbers, making sure patient IDs match with your own enterprise as you take in outside imaging. And the workflow engine contains that type of logic. Beyond that as well, even within a department, the workflow engine can help enhance your current imaging system. So maybe within radiology, there's cases where the workflow engine can resolve discrepancies across study and series descriptions. Maybe it's about splitting studies for chest, abdomen, pelvis. Maybe it's about splitting thicks and thins and sending the thin slices to your 3D solutions and your thick slices to the 2D viewers. Those guys, how your images flow, and really is the enabler around how you truly enable that best of breed visualization solution across your different specialties. So with that, I want to move on into vendor neutrality defined. I have a few more slides, and then we'll take a little break and see if there's any questions out there. And again, please, if there are any questions, feel free to send them in the message window to Dennis.
Hey, Eric, I'm going to jump in real quick. We've got a lot of activity on the chat and in the questions, and we can just pause here for a second. Question came in from one of our constituents here, and it has to deal around an industry-accepted definition of vendor-neutral archive, and when do you expect that there would be some sort of industry-recognized, or maybe there already is that we're unaware of, term to describe or vendor VNA?
Right. You know, I think I'll help to define that a little bit in the next slide. I think that's a good question, though, and I think there are certainly flavors of it today. You know, I think at a high level, you know, individuals would term a vendor-neutral archive as an archive that's storing things, storing data in a standards-based format. It has capabilities to store across many different types of storage devices and it has a flavor of storage management to it. But I think beyond that, you'll see, you know, there are more advanced, in some cases there are more advanced vendor-neutral archives than others. You know, that are going to provide you more capabilities around translations and transformations and abilities to keep data up to date. But if I could maybe finish talking about that, actually the next slide is going to help quite a bit with talking about that question. And I can move on to that unless there's other questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, no, that sounds good. Let's go ahead and move on.
Okay.
Yep.
So you know, let's talk about what is vendor neutrality a little bit. And I'm going to take a minute to go through some of these, you know, highlight some of the features around these different areas. You know, one, when you look for vendor neutrality, you know, number one, it needs to be standards-based. You know, whether that be DICOM and ensuring that the DICOM coming in, you know, is standard. We, for instance, have customers, you know, one particular customer in mind where we integrated more than 130 sites to them. And there were small community hospitals, small imaging centers. Some sites only had a single modality. But it was really eye-opening to see as we ingested the outside imaging data from these different sites, how many of them had something proprietary about them. You know, I'd say more than half of those 135 sites had some proprietary nature about them that required us to fix it. Because their internal systems at this facility, our customer, you know, it was causing their internal visualization and their PAC systems to throw errors and have challenges. You know, so number one, you know, I think your vendor-neutral archive, it needs to have the ability to store in a standards-based, and if it's not in standards-based, you know, have some ability to translate and transform that into a standards format. Because ultimately, your vendor-neutral archive needs to be able to enable your visualization tools, and your visualization tool you have today may not be the same visualization tool you have in 5 years from now. So that starts to touch on, and your vendor-neutral archive needs to be able to translate and transform. So from a translate perspective, you know, as I'm bringing in outside imaging data, can it translate to patient ID? Can it make sure accession numbers are not going to collide? Can it translate series and study descriptions? You know, maybe one department calls it CT head, but you call it head CT. So can it translate those kind of things? You know, and then from a transformation perspective, you know, we see a lot of challenges even around compression algorithms. You know, maybe something was stored in JPEG 2000 lossless, but your visualization tool doesn't support that compression algorithm. You know, how can you simply do it, change it? And as you're evaluating tools that do these types of things, you know, I'd evaluate how easy or hard is it to do those translations and transformations. Does it require the vendor services team to come in, or is it as simple as open up the configuration tool and going through a couple of mouse clicks? You know, I think also on a, you know, from a vendor neutrality perspective, you know, having the capabilities to do some workflow. So workflow around routing and prefetching. You know, looking at vendor neutral archives out there, they should be able to communicate images to different devices, you know, cleanly. And as they communicate those through routing or prefetching, you know, be able to do it along with translation and transformation. Another core component of a vendor-neutral archive is really around the lifecycle management. And one thing I'd highlight here is lifecycle management is not just about purging data. You know, the lifecycle of a study is about, I received this study and I stored it on this storage device. And in 2 years, I'm going to move it to this other storage device, which costs a little less money, although it may be a little slower. You know, it's also about receiving HL7 patient updates, emergence. You know, my wife changed her name. You know, let's make sure we update the database. Let's also make sure that imaging file gets updated when it leaves the vendor neutral archive so that we don't have dirty data later. And lastly, lifecycle management is also about purging, and the VNA should be able to provide you options there. There's a lot of concern around removing any kind of data from archives today for legality reasons. But there are many approaches you can take to that. We see certainly with outside imaging data that's just used for reference, see a lot of our customers are okay with getting rid of that. There's also some hybrid approaches around, if I've stored a study for more than 2 years, well, maybe I can get rid of the thin slices, but leave the thick slices. So as you look at VNAs, do they have those types of capabilities? And that gets along the lifecycle management, gets into the HL7 piece. VNAs should be able to listen to HL7 and take in patient updates, patient merges, and keep that data clean. It should be able to take in order updates. It should be able to use HL7 messages to trigger different workflows like prefetching and different components like that. Another core component of a VNA is really around non-DICOM. The VNA should not be just a device for storing DICOM, but also those non-DICOM objects. And this is where you'll start to see some of the VNAs start to stray a bit. How do the VNA vendors support non-DICOM? Do they keep it in their native formats? So if you looked on the storage device, is it really a .jpeg image? Is it really a .avi movie file? Or are they wrapping it in some proprietary format? And some of them as well will claim that from a non-DICOM perspective that they support it through XDS. I would say one caution there is if dermatology doesn't support DICOM, they probably don't support XDS either. So looking at your enterprise and forming that strategy, I would also take into a lot of consideration around non-DICOM and how that vendor-neutral archive really supports it, because this is where some of the points of differentiation start to vary. Building upon that too is XDS. XDS is certainly seeing more adoption outside of the United States, but as we're seeing, HIEs primarily driven from the States start to build some momentum in some cases. How do we leverage XDS the right way? And when XDS does become a part of our state or our region or our HIE that we're looking to connect to, will your vendor-neutral archive support that? And if it does support it, does it require you to have to do a migration to a secondary module add-on to that VNA? Do they have a secondary repository, XDS repository or XDS registry that you have to purchase? And if it does, what is the migration effort to get into that? Or does it all just natively support it? For instance, if I receive a DICOM image file, I can later have it queried out through XDS consumers. So that's also where I start to see some of the VNA vendors and their strategies and their own products start to differ. Sharing and access, I think we're starting to see more and more the VNA vendors. This gets into the viewer, which is the block underneath, but some VNA vendors are taking different approaches. Some are going completely vendor neutral from a viewer perspective and not providing any viewers. They're providing viewers through partners. Whereas other VNA vendors are building their own viewers and providing those for clinical purposes. I haven't seen any go into the diagnostic realm. But depending on, I certainly see different opinions coming from different sites as to what customers want. Do they want to be able to choose their own viewer and have it stream directly off the VNA, or do they want the VNA vendor to be bringing their own clinical enterprise viewer? And then beyond the access and the viewer piece, how do you share? Some VNA vendors you'll see will have more options around sharing. Some of that sharing being back end through the engine routing, prefetching type workflow, but some of it also being on the front end and sharing not only through CDs and DVDs, but also sharing through emails and encrypted private URLs and time-sensitive URLs and things like that. Almost done here, but talk through a couple more. Another core thing I think most VNA vendors do support really is storage agnostic. This is, a VNA vendor shouldn't care if you have IBM storage or EMC or NetApp or HP or whoever it may be. Does that VNA vendor provide capabilities to work with any different number of storage devices? And with that storage device, what are its levels of capabilities from a storage management perspective? Does it enable you to move between different storage tiers and so forth? And last point I want to highlight here is really around export. No matter what VNA you pick, I would make sure that they have strong capabilities for getting the data out. And the last thing we want to do is lock anyone into another archive for the next 7+ years. Even at Mach7, if you buy our archive and decide to move on from it 5 years from now, you're not locked in. It's a matter of mouse clicks to get the data out, to schedule it to be exported between the hours of whatever you choose, 2 a.m., 6 a.m., and along with prioritizing through prefetch similar functionality. If a patient comes in, it can identify that and prioritize those exports to happen on the top of the queue. So no matter what VNA vendor you pick, I would make sure you're not getting locked into another storage device, another archive. It should be simple to get the data out. So as we look at this, I just threw a lot of terms out there around what kind of makes up a vendor-neutral archive. From that vendor-neutral archive, though, that solution, that enterprise imaging platform, can be used at what I would call different pillars. So starting at department. So within a department, department should be able to take advantage of that vendor-neutral archive and that enterprise imaging platform to resolve PACS and modality limitations. The value is not just at the enterprise level. If there are specialty workflows you need to do for advanced visualization, you need to split thicks and thins, you need to split chest, abdomen, pelvis, you need to get rid of special characters coming on series descriptions, so hanging protocols working your PACS, those types of things should be able to be resolved by your enterprise imaging platform. Teleservices, I've already talked quite a bit about that and how you can, that enterprise imaging platform, as studies come in, be able to make sure order numbers are not duplicated and be able to auto-generate HL7 orders before the studies go into PACS so they don't show up as exceptions or unspecified. To be able to map patient IDs or translate patient IDs, to be able to help out with CDs and DVDs, so that house-site imaging. So that platform should help out in the department. It should also help out in the enterprise. This is kind of the more traditional true VNA case where the vendor-neutral archive is consolidated across radiology and cardiology and dermatology and ophthalmology and whatever other specialties there may be. Along with that as well is, once it's consolidated, you've simplified your image enabling your EMR, you've simplified image enabling your physician and patient portal. And also that platform is helping with consolidating, as you have in an IDN scenario, as you're purchasing and merging with other facilities, consolidating those facilities across disparate PACS systems, across disparate patient identifying schemes and things like that. And then lastly here, just around a region, using that enterprise imaging platform to share across regional hospitals and regional facilities. Similar to the teleservices I talked about in the departments, but how can the VNA be used to, for instance, prefetch from an outside repository, an outside registry? How can it be used to share data with patients as they're being transferred between different facilities? How can the enterprise imaging platform be used with your local HIE? So different things like that. And lastly here in this little section, and we'll pause and take some more questions, is really around the stakeholders. And again, this kind of gets back into the history a little bit, but as we look, PACS 1.0 and PACS 2.0 had a lot of focus on the viewer and the diagnostic tools, and rightfully so. Again, at the end of the day, we're all here to diagnose a patient, provide the best patient care. But we're starting to see that shift. Now, how do we better manage the storage? How do we better manage the life cycle so we control storage cost? How do we make sure the data stays clean, data integrity? When my wife's name changes, I want to make sure that that change is going to be on that image file for the rest of its life. How do we make sure we get the analytics and the data out of the system so we can get proper reimbursement? And then from a patient referring physician side, how do we better enable access to the images and the results, better enable access to share those images and access to those priors? So Dennis, hopefully that answered the question that was out there. Are there any other questions that maybe have come in?
Yeah, there are just a flurry of questions that are coming through the chat, and I think what we want to do is we want to get to one or two of them now, and then obviously we want to make sure that we're saving time at the end to address a lot of these questions. So let's go to this question here from our participant that asked about non-DICOM format images are mentioned as part of the Mach7 VNA. How does Mach7 propose the unstructured images be stored in a VNA?
That's a good question. You know, at Mach7, we really focus on, out of the box, by default, we generally always say, let's keep those non-DICOM images in their native formats. And this is a point of differentiation, I believe, too, with different VNA vendors out there. I think, in general, keeping that data in its native format is best. However, there could be instances, for instance, maybe you get an EKG strip out of cardiology where you want it to be wrapped in DICOM. So that can show up in the cardiology viewer, in their DICOM viewer. So I believe there are some instances where there's value in wrapping it, but by default, our opinion is you keep it in its native format. So with that being said, though, as you're looking at VNA vendors, make sure they're not put into a proprietary format. I think that's kind of the past 2 decades that we're moving out of. That's what's caused a lot of our challenges. So let's keep it in their native, true formats, with a few exceptions. There may be exceptions where it makes sense to wrap in DICOM or wrap in XDS.
Thanks for answering that question. Then the next one that is kind of along the same vein is that data migration is costly, time-consuming, and requires I'll just say it verbatim, requires a boatload of time to deal with reconciliation, not to mention losing private tag data, etc. And the vendors are, I guess, reluctant or aren't cooperating with VNA vendors as readily as they should be because, ultimately there's a lack of maybe customer control. Can you comment on your experience with this with Mach7 customers and vendors that you've worked with?
Yeah. I would say certainly migrations are always, every one of them is unique, and every one of them comes with their own challenges. And just to start off, I think that's a big selling feature for why do you want to get into a VNA? Let's make this the last challenging and difficult migration we have to go through. But to answer some of those questions directly, certainly I think one strength we see of our own VNA is its ability to translate and transform imaging data even through a migration, and having capabilities to do it efficiently. Certainly when you're moving large amounts of data, there's only so much you can move, and often it could take a year or more to migrate your entire repository of data. But with that being said, if you have the right workflow capabilities in place, your VNA should be able to look at the patients coming in the coming days and weeks and prioritize how it migrates. So let's be smart about it. We know it's going to take a long time, but let's be smart about moving the patients and migrating the patient's data that is required first. If I, Eric Rice, am walking into a facility, let's bump Eric Rice's studies to the top of the migration list. So when you look at VNAs, let's make sure their migration tools have those types of capabilities. Again, from a translation and transformation, as you move that data out, I'm almost certain, as most traditional PACS vendors on the market today don't update their DICOM image files, or they have some other proprietary format, with patient updates and merges, you are most likely going to find that the data is dirty. So again, highlighting, with our own solution, and as you're looking at other VNAs, how easy is it for them to clean that data, and resolve those exception cases. In our case, as we move data out, we can query different information systems and modality work lists and things like that to make sure that the data coming out is in sync with what's in the information systems databases. So those files, that data is in sync with what's in the information system, and if it's not, have it updated. So there's different tools and techniques to do that. I think you'll also find as we do more and more migrations, we learn more and more about the proprietary formats in these different vendors' archives. So some of we find some of the archives compress in different algorithms, or they wrap them in tar files, or do different things like that. So there are, as we go, even ourselves, we create new techniques and add it to our library of capabilities that enable us to go directly to storage devices, to reverse some of those proprietary formats. But at the same time, I can't say there's one solution that can do it all. Unfortunately, there are some customers out there where it's going to be a discovery process for ourselves to see if we can do it more efficiently and reverse some of those proprietary formats out. And in some cases, it may not be possible, unfortunately. But again, that goes back to the beginning. Let's try to get to those vendor-neutral archives. So this is the last painful migration we have to do.
Eric, thanks for going in depth into that and articulating that answer. Why don't we go ahead and move this forward here so we can get through the last segment and then obviously address more questions from the people that are on the line.
Okay. I'll try to pick up the pace a little. So considerations in your enterprise imaging strategy. First I'd say, let's form a vision. What is your vision for your site? The way I often look at it is we're going to put in this platform. We're going to come into our customer site and we're going to put in an advanced archive and communication system. We're going to put in an advanced A and C into your system that's really going to form that enterprise imaging platform. But from that, what value are you looking to get out of it? Are you looking to enhance your specialty workflows within your departments? Are you looking to have a best-of-breed visualization approach to your different specialty departments while you standardize the archiving and the communication? Are you looking to better provide sharing and access to the data? This gets into the EMR image enablement and the physician and patient portal. And doing away with CDs and DVDs, how can we use web-based technologies and encrypted time-sensitive email or URLs and things like that? Are you looking to leverage the platform to connect you to an HIE at some point? Maybe are you in a state where an HIE is being built up and they're going to be using XDS standards in the future? Or are you looking to move really even beyond imaging and have one platform that's not only managing radiology and cardiology and dermatology and ophthalmology images, but also looking to manage some docs, some documents. Maybe it's radiology oncology reports. Maybe it's even consent forms. So I would say look at your enterprise strategy and prioritize how you want to go. As we look at our own vendor-neutral archive and our own platform, our own enterprise imaging platform, these are core components of our platform that come along with the product that we're constantly building out and working with our customers to improve. With that too, from a VNA perspective, things to consider, and this question came up a little bit prior, but around storage formats, I always say go standard first. There may be exception cases, again, for instance, in cardiology with EKG strips, you want to wrap in DICOM. That's fine, but I would first make sure that the vendor-neutral archive can store those formats in their standard-based format. You never know if that modality needs to pull back the AVI file or the TIFF or the JPEG or whatever it may be. So as you look into the VNAs, can they store a standard DICOM without doing anything proprietary to it? Can they store a standard non-DICOM media file such as a JPEG or AVI or TIFF without wrapping it? Some of the vendors will tell you that they can take in any kind of format through the use of XDS. Again, I think I would caution a little bit there around if XDS is the right solution for within a department. If dermatology can't support DICOM, it probably can't support XDS. So look into how both DICOM and non-DICOM formats are stored. From a lifecycle management, I talked about this earlier, it's more than just about purging, it's also about keeping the data up to date, patient merges, patient updates. It's about the access controls. If now all of a sudden you have this consolidated image storage device that's storing radiology and cardiology and pathology and wound care and so forth, there needs to be some way of controlling access to it. If I'm if I'm a radiology PACS querying the VNA, maybe I shouldn't see what's in dermatology, and I shouldn't see what's in dental, and I shouldn't see what's in cardiology in my CFIND results that come back. So how can you control that access? How can you also control access to the users? And not only just be restrictive, but also just clearing out the noise. As a physician going into a system and looking at a work list, they may not want to see all the imaging data from these different specialties. Translation and transformation capabilities. We've talked about this a bit. Does that VNA give you the ability to translate and transform the data so it's in a standards-based format? So we don't have to worry about converting proprietary formats to a standards-based later. And especially while you have those front-end systems, those modality and potentially PACS vendors that are creating those proprietary formats now, while they are customers and on good terms, now's the time to work out and figure out how you get some of those things converted in a standards format. Disaster recovery. Does the VNA support disaster recovery, or does it solely depend on storage, the storage vendor, which may be okay too, but there could be some nice advances. For instance, in our VNA, if we're storing into radiology and radiology disaster recovery 100 miles down the street, let's compress it. Let's compress it further. And also, when the PACS queries us, if radiology is down, let's automatically have it fail over to radiology DR without the client and user even knowing. Can it help out with thin slice management? Can we purge off thin slices after a couple of years? Can we anonymize studies for teaching and research? So a bunch of things to think about when you're looking at a VNA. Building upon that too is really around non-DICOM. At Mach7, we have a number of different ways to ingest non-DICOM. Users can browse the file system. It's a user-intensive way of getting non-DICOM in. We also have ways that we can pull folder locations to automatically ingest and associate data to patients and visit information. Ophthalmology is a good example where we can ingest TIFF images and automatically associate it to the right patient and visit. But for those specialties like dermatology and wound care, how can we capture videos and photos and take notes and things like that efficiently? With our, does your VNA vendor that you're looking at, do they have tools that enable you to present a pick list of patient visits, just like a tech would do in radiology? And from that pick list, then take pictures of the mole or the rash and associate it to that patient and visit, and then have it sent to the VNA. How can we, let's learn from those other departments and figure out how we can optimize those workflows. From a communication, so I've talked about the A in PACS a little bit. Now from a communication perspective, the C in PACS, the C in that enterprise imaging platform, how can we optimize the workflows? Again, talking about translating and transforming workflows. Can I have different schedules? Maybe I have a remote site that doesn't have a radiologist on staff after midnight. Can I route it to a different place? Can I auto-generate HL7 orders? Can I fix patient IDs and so forth? Are there ways to do compression and encryption? Does that workflow engine process at a study, series, or image level? I think that's one unique thing for ourselves is processing at an image level, and therefore enable you to have real data intelligence as the data is coming in and figure out exactly where each image needs to go. But it's also about, that enterprise imaging platform also needs to have those similar kind of workflows around non-DICOM. So whether it be HL7, I've talked quite a bit about patient updates and merges. Maybe it's HL7 triggering prefetch workflows. Maybe it's XDS or modality work list. And it's interesting, modality work list, I'm sure most of you already have a DICOM modality work list solution, but what about non-DICOM sources? Do you have a solution for brokering patients and visits so that dermatology and wound care can see a pick list similar to what you see in radiology? Lastly here, I think the last topic we're getting into is really around clinical access and sharing. So we've talked a lot about getting data into your vendor-neutral archive, getting DICOM and non-DICOM, but even beyond that, getting the image results, the lab results, even medications and allergies can be stored in some VNAs. How do we then take that and make it accessible for viewing and for sharing? A couple of things I would highlight. When you're looking at VNAs and if you're looking for vendors to stream off of your VNA, look at, the standard today, you want a universal viewer and you want it zero footprint. I like to educate, and some of you are probably more educated than I, but I like to educate a little bit on what it really is universal. To me, there's two flavors of universal. There's universal format. Does that viewer support displaying DICOM as well as JPEGs and AVI files and MPEGs and so forth? But also there's a universal platform. So does it work on a Windows? Does it work on your iPhone and iPad or your Android device? So two flavors of universal there, both universal format and universal platform. From a zero footprint, there's also two flavors. Does that viewer have any clinical footprint? So as you stream images, video files, or audio files, or whatever it may be to that viewer, does it have a clinical footprint? If my laptop were to crash and boot back up, is there going to be any image file on that laptop? You don't want that to happen. You want it to be a zero clinical footprint. Same thing from an IT footprint. Is there anything to install? Does it require Flash or Silverlight or some kind of ActiveX control to be downloaded? Most of the new viewers coming out today require a modern browser through HTML5, and given you have an HTML5, there's zero IT footprint required. Along with clinical access too, does it have a URL-based integration? Can it be launched from an EMR? And when it gets launched from an EMR or a portal, does it have proper authentication and authorization mechanisms to authenticate the user? Does it use encrypted URLs or a direct API approach? And those are the types of things you want to look at. And secondly, too, beyond the VNA vendor's direct viewer, if they have one, looking at those third-party viewers, how do they integrate off the VNA? Pretty much any viewer off of any VNA can integrate through DICOM query retrieves. Most of them support WADO. You can do routing and prefetching to image enable those third-party viewers. But some of the more advanced ones are starting to do synchronous image level DICOM streaming or WADO RS or even Mint. So as you're evaluating different VNA vendors, what protocols and standards do they support? And the viewers that you're evaluating, do they also support that? And then even beyond that, I call it the seamless approach. We're starting to see more and more viewer vendors directly integrate to VNAs through APIs that go directly to the storage device. So obviously that's kind of the fastest and best option from a speed perspective. And then building on clinical access and sharing, from an access perspective, does it support displaying the medical images in their native formats, or again, does it require them to be wrapped in some format? Do you need it to, and does it support displaying the medications and the allergies along with the images? Does it support showing the image results along with the images, or maybe even the lab results? Does it provide you a timeline, and can you hang your priors side by side? And those are the types of things we often get requested. From a sharing perspective, can you share via an email or URL? And again, those URLs being time sensitive and encrypted and secure. Can you deal with CDs and DVDs? And I think you'll find some VNA vendors are better than others at dealing with non-standard CDs and DVDs, as well as PACS, EMR, and even clouds. Be able to share to Life Image or Emix or some other cloud-based sharing option. So in summary, last slide. I know I'm running a little bit late, but in summary, I'd say stabilize your enterprise archive and communication layers across departments. You want to consolidate all that storage and stabilize it. Enable the picture systems to be good at visualization, but you to stabilize from an enterprise perspective the storage and the communication. Perform that last migration to that platform. That migration is probably going to be painful, unfortunately. But once you migrate into that VNA, you're taking ownership and control of that data. Make sure it's standard-based. Make sure it's not proprietary, and control it. Consolidate across all your specialties, both DICOM and non-DICOM. Once you've done that, you've simplified the image enablement up to the EMR. You've simplified the image enablement up to that portal. With that enterprise imaging strategy, enable specialty departments to select their best-of-breed viewers. Select a VNA that supports having other diagnostic specialty viewers integrate to it. Enable that flexibility and further enable the flexibility of those physicians to switch. It doesn't need to be, you don't need to get locked into a visualization tool for the next 7+ years. Simplify and reduce cost of future mergers and acquisitions. Maybe you're at an IDN and you're acquiring other facilities. How can you simplify and reduce those costs to plug in those new systems and translate patient IDs and to translate accession numbers and things like that? Provide, with that platform too, provide new revenue streams. How can you expand that enterprise imaging platform to potentially even offer off-site storage for other facilities in your region? To enable teleservices into your facility that maybe you hadn't been able to enable before. Or even to become, we've even had customers talk to us about being the clearinghouse for HIE work within their own state. So maybe their state is providing an XDS infrastructure, but most facilities in their region don't support XDS, so have them send their data through you and you become that XDS clearinghouse. And lastly here, reducing those long-term storage costs. Our VNA and many VNAs out there will give you the ability to compress, and manage storage from different tiers of storage with that enterprise imaging platform. So with that, I know I went over, Dennis, I apologize, but if there are any questions, I'd certainly look forward to taking them.
Yeah, no, there's a ton of questions, so just want to let everybody know that we're at the top of the hour. We are going to stay on the line and address as many questions as we possibly can of people that are interested in hearing the questions that have been asked throughout the course of the webinar, and also getting those addressed as well now. What I'm going to do, because we are at the top of the hour, is I'm going to launch a polling question. At the same time, while we're doing that, we're going to begin to jump in, Eric, to our Q&A. And the first question that I am looking to cherry pick here from the chat, which there's been a lot, has to deal with. Just give me one moment. I'm going to pause and just find it because it was a good one. So you had mentioned that earlier on in the presentation that LifeImage, which is a cloud solution as well as a VNA, have you ever done any sort of work with them in that capacity? And in addition to that, what OEMs have you worked with in collaboration to deliver your Mach7 technology? Yep.
Well, certainly there's a, specifically with LifeImage, we certainly have shared customers where a lot of times outside imaging data or at these shared customers, the outside imaging data ingested from LifeImage will then go through our system to further normalize it or route it to the right place. So there's collaboration there as far as how the solutions work together. From an OEM perspective, we certainly have partners, from many different respects, from different PACS vendors to viewer solutions, as well as storage. Being neutral, we try to work with a lot of different vendors, and have not necessarily any preferences, and really trying to build that out.
Great. So next question comes from a participant by the name of Robert. He asked a question about VNA stores images from many systems and organizations with different MRNs. How do you ensure that Mary Smith is or is not Mary Smith so that they have an accurate view of the patient across the spectrum of care?
Yep, that's a good question. So that is a good thing when you're evaluating a VNA. You want to make sure it can support multiple patient IDs for a single patient. So our solution does that, and and as part of that, there's a concept, more from an IHE perspective of assigning authorities. So as different data comes in from different sources, knowing the assigning authority from this PACS system being different from assigning authority from a different PACS system, enables you to identify those patient IDs differently. You can think of an assigning authority almost as an org, different org code. But along with that too, the VNA should have capabilities to do some patient matching. Maybe not, patient matching being able to query a PICS manager or an MPI solution through PICS queries and do translations of those patient IDs as they come in.
All right, so we have we are recording this webinar. So I just want to let everybody know that we are, this will be available on demand, ASAP, and you'll be notified by email that it's available to review once again. Also apologize to our attendee, Larry, who was having problems throughout today's webinar viewing this item on, I guess, the browser that he may have been using. So good news is that it has been recorded, and we'll make sure that you get a copy. Got another question that came in from Kim. So does Mach7, and I think you addressed this somewhat, Eric, does Mach7 have a physician workflow appropriate solution for the integration of images acquired on mobile devices such as the iPhone? Specifically, a workflow that supports the standardized assignment of a study or image description and linking the image to the appropriate patient encounter within the EMR.
Yep, absolutely. You know, I think that was, I had one slide on the iModality. It's the product that it's what we call the iModality product at Mach7. And, you know, what we do there is similar to radiology, you know, we broker patient and visit information coming out of the EMR. So, you know, when you go into dermatology or wound care or whatever it may be, they don't know what orders are, like session numbers are, like they do in radiology and cardiology. So in dermatology, wound care, places like that, we'll broker patient and visit information coming out of your EMR and then present that as a pick list on those mobile devices such as an iPhone. And so as a dermatologist logs into their iPhone, they see a pick list for their department for the day. They can select that patient and visit information, and the exact attributes that are there. You know, there's always a patient name, a patient ID. There's always some type of visit number, encounter number, but the other attributes are all configurable. So if you need a description field or whatever it may be, those types of things are configurable. And as you select that, you then go to the next screen. You can take your pictures, you can take video, you can take audio. You can even do voice recognition, for instance, on the iPhone using Siri, and then have all that sent into the VNA. And as it's sent into the VNA, it correlates each of those images and video files and audio files to that patient visit.
Right on. So we're going to take two more questions, but a very brief pause here. So our polling question had asked how many people are attending HIMSS. About 40% of our participants today said that they're going to the show. So I'm expecting 100% of those 40% to make sure that they stop by the Mach7 Technologies booth at HIMSS, which is 3715. Find us at the show. Let's connect and make sure that we get you introduced to Eric while we're there. So we've got time for two more questions, Eric, online here, and this question comes from a participant that said, how do we get data from multiple different PACS vendors into Mach7? Does Mach7 allow for third-party API access?
Yep. So certainly Mach7 does have API access to be able to extract and also insert data in. You know, generally from another PACS, this is where we get into the migration discussion of how you migrate the data in. You know, when we talk about migrations, there's usually two forms. There's the traditional form where you're doing C-finds and C moves against a PACS. It's generally more resource intensive. It generally will affect a bit more of the performance of your PACS. Therefore, it's often throttled up overnight to carry more load. But there's also migration techniques that we have that we can go directly to the storage device and not affect that PACS performance. So go directly to the storage device, pull data directly off of that storage device and put it into the VNA. You know, that is a more preferred approach, and we can do that with most vendors. However, there are some vendors who, as we talked about before, have some proprietary formats that we can't go to the storage device for and therefore have to go in through the front end. But that's generally how we'll do that.
All right. So let's see here. One more question. Let's go to this one has non-DICOM and XDS conversation written all over it. What if the non-DICOM object is proprietary in its native format? If you want to store it, how would you view the object?
So if it's non-DICOM in its native format, it's a good evaluation piece for your viewer. So for instance, at Mach7, our clinical enterprise viewer supports displaying images in their native format. So if it's DICOM, it's going to show it in a DICOM viewer. If it's non-DICOM, it's a JPEG or a TIFF or even a video file, it will show that also in its native format within that same viewer. So the viewer is designed to stream up different media of many different formats. But it does raise an interesting question. When you're evaluating VNAs and other viewers, there's certainly a lot of DICOM viewers out on the market. But as you're evaluating them, do you need to wrap everything in DICOM just so you can support your enterprise viewer? Or do you need to put a requirement on the enterprise viewer to be able to support those non-DICOM formats? And if they do, and if it is a third-party viewer and it supports only non-DICOM, then does it have a standards-based way, or is it integrated to that VNA of choice to be able to view those? A standards-based way could be through XDS, for instance, to be able to query the VNA through XDS consumer protocols to be able to get that out. So in summary, though, our viewer supports displaying DICOM and non-DICOM formats.
Great. So Eric, this is going to bring us to the conclusion of our webinar. We're over on our time, but appreciate everybody dialing in today to see the webinar. Before we go, I want to give you the last words, Eric, in closing thoughts.
Well, I certainly appreciate everyone's time. It's always great to hear questions from all of you in the industry, and I think a big part of, as I kind of stated in the beginning, a big part of the way our product has been architected and developed to date is from learning from our customers, learning from the market. As much as I like to step on a soapbox and talk about it in the industry, I also learn quite a bit. So I thank everyone for their time today.
Thank you. That concludes our webinar for today. Thank you.
Thank you.